Hello, this is Mark Dunning, President of AWRRDA. Welcome to this month's posting of Windows on Water Management, short interviews with leaders in water resources management that provide a window into their perspectives and practice. Today we're honored to have with us Amy Larson, Esquire, President of the National Waterways Conference. The National Waterways Conference is devoted to promoting policies and programs that recognize the public value of the nation's water resources and their contribution to public safety, a competitive economy, national security, environmental quality, and energy conservation. Ms. Larson's impressive bio can be found in this posting. The focus of today's interview is on the recently passed Water Resources Reform and Development Act. A WRRDA, or WRRDA, as such acts are generally known, are extremely important laws that establish the rules of the game regarding water resources project development, as well as authorizing specific water resources projects for construction. Amy is an expert in these acts, particularly the most recent act that was passed in June of this year, and will give us a brief overview of some of the most salient details. Thanks for being with us today, Amy.
Thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, I have a few questions for you. The first is, what is a WRRDA, or a WRRDA, and why should we care?
Historically, water resources legislation, the Water Resources Development Act, or affectionately known in the industry as WRRDA, was enacted every 2 years to authorize a variety of navigation, flood control, and environmental projects and studies carried out by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And these projects are most often cost-shared with non-federal sponsors. Equally important to the project authorizations, WRRDAs establish U.S. policy on water resources development and protection. These projects provide numerous benefits to the nation, and most of these tend to be overlooked or ignored. So let's start with a few fun facts about that. More than 630 million tons of cargo moves along the inland waterways, including agricultural products, petroleum, chemicals, coal, iron, steel, and other other raw materials. And this includes more than 80 million tons of grain, which is about 60% of the nation's grain bound for export. In addition, more than 95% of overseas trade moves to the nation's harbors, and the U.S. maritime transportation industry accounts for nearly $2 trillion in commerce and creates employment for about 13 million people. Other projects besides navigation, hydropower accounts for nearly 80% of the United States' total renewable electricity generation, making it the top renewable energy source in the country. And with respect to flood control, nearly 50% of Americans live in counties with levees or related flood protection infrastructure. And these Corps of Engineers levee projects are critically important. They provide a 6-to-1 return ratio on flood damages prevented compared to the initial costs. And on the Mississippi River and Tributaries project, that includes a 44-to-1 return on investment ratio.
Those are really impressive figures. It's obvious that these kinds of water resources projects have a great positive impact on our quality of life.
Absolutely. It's critical to our economic well-being and our position in the global economy. And that information was really reflected this year in enactment of this Water Resources and Reform Development Act. It was enacted in an overwhelmingly bipartisan fashion in both the House and the Senate, and then it was signed into law by the President on June 10th, making it the first WRRDA since 2007.
Great. It's good to hear that there's something that both houses of the Congress can agree on. I note that the title of this year's bill contains an extra R for reform. What does that mean, and what does the legislation do?
The legislation contains a variety of reforms to the way water projects are funded and developed, but I think we need to start with a word about earmarks, or congressionally directed spending. And while unfortunate examples of wasteful spending tend to grab the headlines, what's overlooked is the important role of the Congress in making these decisions relating to investments in the nation's water resources infrastructure. And water projects are different than other projects. They are scrutinized really to a greater extent than any other capital investment program in the government. These projects are formulated separately to address specific and discrete problems, so that by the time they might be considered for authorization in AWRRDA, a project has been studied from top to bottom, local community, all the way up, subject to a comprehensive analysis using merit-based criteria. And there's public involvement at every phase of this process. In addition, local sponsors are responsible for substantial shares of these project costs. So projects start at that base level with local support. Because of the current moratorium on earmarks, this year when the Congress was crafting this legislation, it worked really hard to develop a new approach to obtaining these project authorizations, conducted in a transparent manner, while still retaining the Congress's constitutional oversight responsibilities. And in particular, Chairman Schuster of House Transportation and Infrastructure was really honed in on that point. So this new process calls for the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works to submit an annual report to Congress identifying these studies and proposed projects that meet certain criteria. So this process, importantly, provides these non-federal sponsors and local stakeholders the opportunity to identify their project needs, and it provides needed transparency, sunlight into the entire process, but also requires the Assistant Secretary to identify what projects didn't make the cut and identify why. We know that this new bill includes a lot of project authorizations. Importantly, to reduce the backlog on other projects, it deauthorizes certain projects, maybe those that don't receive funding and no longer have an active local sponsor.
Very interesting. Yeah, the idea of getting some of the projects off the books sounds like a good idea.
Well, when we talk about the Corps' backlog of projects, we hear figures like $60 billion, but it's not clear if that's a legitimate number, because some of those projects may have never received funding and they might have been authorized decades ago. So it's important, and part of this bill requires the Corps to take a look at those projects so we get a true idea of the projects that are out there pending.
Okay.
The bill also includes several other reforms. Included in that is a project streamlining provision. We hear a lot that some of these project studies take an awful long time. And so the new bill codifies a core program known as 3x3x3. So it requires the completion of a feasibility study in 3 years at a cost of $3 million with 3 levels of review within the Corps of Engineers. And as a companion to that, the law also makes the Corps the lead agency for the necessary environmental reviews, coordinating with other federal agencies, including EPA and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And importantly, WRRDA does not make any substantive changes to those underlying environmental reviews, but it simply coordinates them and imposes some time restrictions so that they are done in a prompt manner. Another element of reforms includes financing options. There are currently cost-share obligations among all of these projects with their federal and non-federal sponsors, but WRRDA includes a variety of new alternative financing options, additional contributed funds from stakeholders, things like permit processing and lock operations, pilot programs for public-private partnerships, which I think people are still figuring out how that might apply to their particular project, and a Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, known as WIFIA, which is modeled after the TIFIA program for transportation projects. So bear in mind, this law was just signed on June 10th by the President, so the industry and stakeholders are really taking a close look at a lot of these things to figure out how it might help them as they move ahead with projects. And I think it's also worth noting, WRRDA authorizes projects. It doesn't give any money out. So projects are now authorized, and we still need to go through the appropriations committees to figure out what can be funded and what are projects that are worthy of that federal appropriation. So that's a process that's ongoing as well.
Right, Right. Yeah. The two-phase process. You get the authorization, then you've got to get the appropriated fund.
Well, and that sometimes is a little more difficult, particularly in this climate. But I think as we're looking at alternative financing options, we can see around the country with different kinds of projects, people taking a real close look at that and maybe talking that through with the administration and with the appropriators to figure out how they can avail themselves of these new opportunities.
Sure,
and
right.
in conjunction with that are these project delivery reforms, also one of those R's in the new WRRDA bill. And these provisions would allow non-federal sponsors to carry out some of the feasibility studies and the actual construction of projects, subject to a variety of conditions and requirements detailed in the Act, so that it allows the non-federal sponsors to be actively engaged at the ground level of some of these projects to allow for greater coordination and perhaps a more streamlined project. So there is a pilot program in WRRDA, and the Corps has 180 days to try to establish this program. So we'll be watching that and working with the Corps as they come up with implementation guidance.
Sounds really interesting and exciting, actually, to me. So if I had to summarize what you told us, it seems that this WRRDA is focused on providing more empowerment to local interests for project development and providing ways to reduce the time it takes for projects to be developed, and also trying to find ways to stretch the federal dollar to finance more projects using innovative public-private partnerships and the like. These are all things that project sponsors have been advocating for quite some time, as you well know. So it appears to me that someone's been listening. Is that right?
Absolutely. The last WRRDA before this was in 2007. So there has been a lot of discussion in recent years about when we might see new water resources legislation. And in this Congress, the chairs of the respective oversight committees, Senate Environment and Public Works and House Transportation and Infrastructure, really worked hard from the beginning of this Congress. They had several hearings and roundtables. They had numerous other discussions and meetings with stakeholders to gather their views on what should be included in the bills. What are their concerns in terms of project development and implementation? What are some other ways to reform the process? So the end result, this WRRDA bill that was just signed into law, really is a compromise. It balances the needs and interests and the perspectives of the Congress and the industry. It was a collaborative process.
Great. Well, there are, this is an enormous bill, I know, but there are a couple more specific parts of the Act that I know you want to tell us about. So we got a little bit more time. So what else is worth noting here?
Well, I can't say most importantly. There's a lot of important components of this, but there are 34 projects that were authorized in this Water Resources Reform and Development Act, and the non-federal sponsors have been eagerly awaiting that and are ready to get to work on those projects: navigation, flood control, ecosystem restoration, a variety of projects. So those project authorizations are done and people are ready to move forward. When we typically think about WRRDA, we think about navigation and flood control. So I'll highlight a couple of those items, knowing that there's a whole lot more in this bill. But in terms of navigation, there are several provisions to reform the Corps' project delivery process for inland waterways, particularly lock and dam infrastructure. In addition, there's several studies and reports that are required to look at new funding mechanisms. How do we fund this aging infrastructure to ensure we remain competitive in the global economy? In terms of the nation's ports and harbors, the bill calls for increased expenditures from the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, which is a tax to fund the dredging of the nation's ports and harbors. Turning to the levee safety program, there's a big title impacting levee safety, and the law adopts a new comprehensive levee safety program that expands federal flood risk management activities over local flood protection. given the complexity of this title and the great variation of flood control measures across the country in terms of riverine flooding and riverine flood control structures and things that might be around the city of Sacramento, we could spend another session just on this issue. But just wrapping that up in a nutshell, with an eye towards ensuring the safety of those living behind levees and other flood control structures, my organization will be working to ensure that these new programs and implementation of called for guidelines don't result in unintended consequences by imposing costly or burdensome requirements on these communities, but in fact are focused on enhancing public safety. So we could go on this. As you know, this bill is several hundred pages long, but I think those will give us the highlights, Mark.
Great. It sounds like a very important act, and I know it's very early to judge this, but based on your experience, do you think this WRRDA has the potential to be sort of a groundbreaking act that significantly affects water resources development policy, sort of like some of the other more notable WRRDAs, like 1986, for example, comes to mind?
Certainly, I think when we look at implementation guidance and how many of these provisions are ultimately implemented, the 2014 legislation will be right up there with 1986 on a couple of different aspects of it. Certainly in a time of declining federal budgets, non-federal sponsors and stakeholders will be looked upon to take on more responsibility for the development and maintenance of these projects. But in addition, looking at the reforms and policy changes, they signal a new way to do business. So just at the beginning phase of this, there's a lot to digest. And we are now, after 2 years of working to get this bill passed, now looking at how it will be implemented.
Great. As I say, it really sounds exciting, and I think it's something that our listeners need to be aware of and look into, because it certainly seems like it will affect water resources policy going forward. Amy, are any other final thoughts or takeaways for our listeners?
Well, going forward, I think it's important not to take these water resources projects for granted or not to ignore them. We need to remind our decision makers at the federal and local levels of the importance of maintaining these projects. Critically important when we're looking at declining budgets. But let's just think about what are some of the benefits that they provide to us. An environmentally sound and energy efficient waterways transportation system, life-saving flood control, shore protection, water-based recreation, water supplies, hydropower production, ecosystem restoration, all things that we are truly dependent on for our quality of life. So let's just remember those benefits as we go forward.
Great. Very, very important to keep that in mind. Well, Amy, thanks so much for being with us today. I'm sure our listeners have benefited from your experience and insights about this critical new water resources policy that is now going to be implemented. So again, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
Great. Well, to all the listeners, thanks for being with us today on Windows on Water Management. Watch this space for more interviews with leaders in water resources management in the coming months. Until next time, this is Mark Dunning signing off.